In 1842, in the oppressive heat of Montgomery County, Alabama, a plantation widow named Amelia Hawthorne began a hidden ceremony that blurred the lines between healing and homicide, between reason and insanity. This is a tale that was never supposed to surface. It was concealed beneath layers of secrecy, locked in county archives where whole sections were excised with a blade, and only murmured by the ears of those who witnessed it. Those who knew that certain realities are so venomous they corrupt the ground they're interred in. Shadowbrook Plantation was an empire of cotton, 1,200 acres of white treasure sustained by the toil of 50 enslaved individuals. At its core rose the Grand House, a stone and pillar tribute to the Hawthorne family's supremacy, a lineage that gauged its heritage in eras of control. Amelia was the sovereign of this domain, a New Orleans bride transported to Shadowbrook 20 years prior. She was renowned for her steely blue eyes, eyes that workers claimed could peer not merely into a space, but into a person's ancestry, their history, their concealed truths. She oversaw Shadowbrook with the accuracy of a clocksmith, every social gathering a seamless spectacle, every account impeccably aligned. But beneath the facade of Southern decorum, Amelia was nurturing a separate form of wisdom. Late into the night, by the lone glow of a taper, she wasn't perusing verse or holy writ. She was consuming medical volumes from Boston, examining anatomy, poisons, and the obscure mystical doctrines of heredity and lineages. She packed notebooks with notes that bore no relation to crop outputs, and everything to do with the bodily characteristics, the veiled pasts of the individuals she possessed. She was hunting for a reality her spouse Elias had taken extreme measures to hide. A reality so deep, so invasive, that when he perished, it didn't perish alongside him. Instead, it was set free. Elias Hawthorne's demise on April 5, 1842, was formally noted as a stomach ailment. No one challenged it. Gentlemen of his rank, with their lavish meals and nightly brandies, frequently expired abruptly. He was 54, a foundation of the society, and his burial was a grave procession of Montgomery County's aristocracy. His wife, Amelia, positioned at the burial site, an ideal effigy of sorrow in ebony velvet, her visage obscured by a dense shroud. She displayed no feeling. Not one tear was observed to descend. Neighbors murmured it was her aloof New Orleans upbringing, her extraordinary poise. They had no notion that what they beheld wasn't poise, it was concentration. It was the eerie serenity of a hunter that has endured patiently for the pursuit to commence. The instant the final attendee's wagon clattered off from Shadowbrook, Amelia's authentic labor started. She didn't withdraw to her quarters to lament. She descended into the moist, soil-scented gloom of the storage vault. There, concealed within a secured oak crate, was her genuine legacy from Elias. Not the terrain, not the funds, but the proof of his final treachery. It was an assortment of correspondences, bills for odd health provisions, and a modest ebony hide notebook crammed with her own intricate fixated script. For 60 minutes, by the sputtering illumination of a lamp, she perused every term anew, her countenance a disguise. This was not a widow grieving her mate. This was a researcher assessing her studies, a commander concluding her strategy of assault. The strategy was not merely about lamenting or even progressing, it was about rectification, cleansing, and a dreadful devouring type of equity that she solely would administer. She was on the verge of becoming the healer, the arbiter, and the enforcer, all inside the secluded confines of her own estate. The day following the interment, 3 males were called to the primary residence. They were not laborers in the fields. They were the premier of Shadowbrook's captive populace, males whose abilities rendered them essential. There was Jeremiah Ellis, the expert woodworker, whose palms could erect a shed from a heap of lumber. He was educated, an uncommon and perilous attribute for a captive in Alabama. Then, there was Elias Grant, the metalworker, a figure of vast bodily might who could shape steel to his desire with flame and mallet, his quietude as weighty as the alloy he manipulated. And lastly, Nathaniel Hayes, Elias Hawthorne's intimate attendant, a figure who had matured in the residence, schooled to be vigilant, clever, and completely confidential. He comprehended the proprietor's mysteries superior to anyone, maybe even superior to Amelia. They positioned before her in Elias's office, the atmosphere still dense with the aroma of his pipes. Amelia seated behind his enormous walnut workstation, a monarch on her seat. She regarded each of them, her blue eyes lingering, evaluative. She didn't perceive them as individuals, she viewed them as containers, as elements in a formula of her own creation. She informed them they had been chosen for a unique obligation, a fresh health regimen she necessitated to sustain her own well-being. She mentioned a celebrated French doctor, of water therapy, of conserving her energy now that she was solitary. Her tone was level, bereft of sentiment, the tone of a naturalist depicting a vivisection. They had no option but to consent. Denial was not an idea that prevailed for them, but as she articulated, something profounder transpired among them, a flow of unvoiced awareness. She maintained their stare an instant too prolonged. And in that stare was a horrifying closeness. It was a glance that conveyed, "I know who you are. I know where you came from. I know what flows in your veins." A murmured historical rumor. The old folks used to say that on the night Amelia Hawthorne died, every clock in the main house at Shadowbrook stopped at the exact same moment. They said it wasn't a soul leaving. It was a debt coming due. The ritual began at dawn at Whispering Brook, a languid oak-choked stream that wound through the eastern edge of the plantation. The air was cold, the mist rising from the dark water like spirits. Amelia led them to a secluded curve hidden from the main house, a place where the world felt thin, where the rules of God and man seemed not to apply. She carried a linen-wrapped bundle. Jeremiah, Elias, and Nathaniel followed, their minds a whirlwind of confusion and fear. What treatment required the master's widow and 3 of her slaves to gather at a creek before sunrise? What medicine could possibly be found here? Amelia's instructions were simple, direct, and monstrous in their intimacy. They would all undress. They would enter the water together. They would remain silent. She spoke with the authority of a priestess, not a mistress. Any man who spoke of this, she warned, would be sold west to the rice swamps of Mississippi, a death sentence delivered in 4 years of brutal labor. But the threat was almost secondary to the power in her eyes. It was a power that seemed to draw on a knowledge so dark and specific, it paralyzed them before she ever laid a hand on them. She disrobed without hesitation, her pale skin stark against the gloom of the pre-dawn light. She was not a woman before them. She was an instrument of some terrible purpose. She stepped into the frigid water, her face impassive, and instructed them to form a triangle around her. Can you imagine that? The terror, the humiliation, the sheer surreal horror of that moment. Standing naked in the cold water, with the woman who owned your body, your life, your future, as she prepared to enact a ritual you couldn't possibly comprehend. What happened next was an act of medical violation disguised as a sacred rite. Amelia unwrapped her bundle, revealing not medicine, but tools, a razor with an ebony handle, glass vials filled with clear, acrid-smelling liquids, and the small black leather book. She opened it and began to read aloud, her voice a low, rhythmic chant in a language they did not recognize. It was not English. It was not French. It sounded ancient, guttural, words that felt like they were being dredged up from the earth itself. One by one she approached them. She washed their bodies with the creek water, a strange methodical purification. Her touch was not sensual, not even human. It was clinical, like a veterinarian examining livestock. She applied one of the liquids from the vials, a substance that burned their skin with a cold fire. Then came the razor. With surgical precision, she made a small, shallow cut on each man's left shoulder, directly over a peculiar arc-shaped birthmark that until that moment none of them had known the other shared. She collected the beads of blood that welled up on small squares of white cloth. She didn't flinch. She didn't hesitate. She mixed their blood with another chemical from a vial, creating a dark, viscous paste, and then, as the sun began to break through the trees, she applied the mixture to her own body, rubbing it into her chest, her abdomen, her throat, all while her chanting grew louder, more feverish. When it was over, there was silence, broken only by the sound of the water and their own ragged breathing. "Tomorrow," she said, her voice a whisper. The same time. Then she dressed and walked back to the house as if returning from a simple morning stroll, leaving 3 broken men shivering on the banks of Whispering Brook, bound together by a secret too terrible to speak. Something was stolen from them at the brook. Not just blood, not just dignity. Something elemental, a light in the soul. Within 2 weeks, the change in Jeremiah, Elias, and Nathaniel was undeniable. These were once men of presence, of skill, of quiet strength. Now they moved through their days like ghosts wrapped in a thick, invisible fog. Jeremiah, the brilliant carpenter, would stand for long moments staring at a piece of wood, the memory of how to join it to another seemingly erased from his mind. Elias at the forge would let the iron grow cold, his powerful arms hanging limp at his sides, his focus shattered. Nathaniel, who had been raised to anticipate every need in the great house, now struggled to remember simple instructions. Their eyes, that was the most terrifying change. They became dull, vacant, as if the person behind them had retreated to some deep, unreachable place. Sophia, a house servant who had grown up with Nathaniel, saw it most clearly. She cornered him one afternoon by the kitchens, her heart aching. "Nathaniel, what is she doing to you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He just stared at her, his eyes looking right through her, a flicker of confusion crossing his face as if he was trying to remember her name. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away. The enslaved community felt the darkness spreading. This was more than a cruel mistress. This was root work. This was conjure. This was a dark magic pulled from some forbidden place. They whispered that Mistress Amelia was feeding on them, draining their life force to fuel her own. They were right. But the mechanism wasn't magic. It was chemistry. And the source wasn't Baton Rouge or the Gulf Coast. It was a disgraced physician in New Orleans, and a lie that had been festering at the heart of Shadowbrook for nearly 2 decades. A chilling visual description. Imagine the storage vault beneath the main house, not as a place for storing vegetables, but as an apothecary of madness. Jars of mercury compounds and arsenic preparations glowing faintly in the lantern light, arranged on shelves next to preserved roots and dried herbs. The air thick with the smell of damp earth and chemical decay. A scent of science corrupted by obsession. If you've come this far, comment. The brook remembers below. You're not just watching a story. You're bearing witness to something that was deliberately erased. Amelia's children saw the change in their mother, too. Her strange new habit of rising before dawn, returning an hour later with damp hair and a strange feverish energy in her eyes. 12-year-old Theodore asked where she went. She told him it was for her constitution, a walk to clear her head. She warned him never to follow, that the morning air was unhealthy for a boy like him. It was a lie, of course, but one he was too young to question. Her eldest daughter, Eliza, was 16. She was not a child. She was perceptive with her mother's sharp eyes and a growing sense of dread. Eliza noticed more than the morning walks. She saw the way her mother now studied Jeremiah, Elias, and Nathaniel during the day. Her gaze not that of a mistress to a slave, but of a biologist observing a specimen in a jar. She saw the black leather book her mother now kept with her at all times, even sleeping with it tucked under her pillow. Eliza saw her mother, a woman consumed by a recent widow's grief, losing weight, yet crackling with an unnatural vitality. It was as if she were being lit from within by a cold, unholy fire. One morning, Eliza's fear overcame her caution. She slipped out of the house after her mother, determined to see where she went. But Amelia was waiting for her, a shadow among the pine trees at the edge of the path to the brook. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. She grabbed Eliza's wrist, her fingers like iron bands, and her voice was a venomous whisper. "If you ever follow me again," she hissed, "if you ever speak of this to anyone, I will personally ensure you die an old maid in this house. You will have no husband, no children, no life. Do you understand me?" Eliza, terrified by the stranger her mother had become, could only nod before fleeing back to the house, the ghost of her mother's touch burning on her skin. That night, Eliza wrote in her diary, the words spilling onto the page in a frantic scrawl. My mother is no longer my mother. A stranger has taken her place, one who walks and speaks like her, but is hollowed out inside. There is a wrongness about her, a smell like burnt metal and sickness that clings to her clothes when she returns from the brook. I do not know what she does there, but it is an evil thing. I feel it in the bones of this house. It is a poison, and it is spreading, and I fear it will consume us all. This entry, discovered decades later, is one of the few surviving eyewitness accounts from within the family. It's the testimony of a child watching her parent transform into a monster. But who could she tell? Her father was dead. The local reverend? What could she possibly say that wouldn't sound like the fantasy of a hysterical girl? That her mother was meeting slaves at the brook for a secret ritual in the antebellum South? That accusation was so unthinkable, so beyond the pale of accepted reality that the person making it would be judged insane, not the person it was made against. So Eliza did what so many trapped people do. She watched, she waited, and she documented the horror in the one place she thought was safe, the pages of her hidden journal. Meanwhile, Amelia continued to play her part flawlessly. She managed the spring planting. She hosted visitors. She maintained the perfect facade of the capable grieving widow. But at night, in the privacy of her room, she documented her own version of events. She wrote not of grief, but of dosages, not of loss, but of blood draws. She recorded the steady, terrifying decline of her three subjects, noting their tremors, their memory loss, their fading vitality, all with the detached precision of a laboratory scientist. She was cataloging their destruction, and in the same entries celebrating her own renewal. By June, the deterioration of the three men was too obvious to be dismissed as a simple sickness. Dr. Elias Thorne, the same physician who had signed Elias's death certificate, noticed it during a routine visit to Shadowbrook. He was an old man, his medical knowledge decades out of date, but he was a keen observer. He saw Nathaniel Hayes carrying firewood, his hands trembling so violently he could barely hold the logs. He saw Jeremiah attempting a simple repair on a porch railing, his movement slow, clumsy, his eyes unfocused. He saw men who had been prime examples of physical strength now wasted, gaunt, their skin a sickly, jaundiced color. He mentioned it to Amelia, his brow furrowed with professional concern. "Is there an illness spreading through your people, Mistress Hawthorne?" he asked. Amelia, ever composed, had an answer ready. It was a recurring fever from the lands, she explained, a form of ague she was treating them herself with quinine and calomel, the standard remedies of the day. Dr. Thorne accepted her explanation, but a seed of doubt was planted. He was a thorough man, and he knew the signs of calomel treatment. It stained the gums a distinct blue-gray. He had seen no such stain in the men's mouths. It was a small detail, a tiny inconsistency, but in the silent, oppressive atmosphere of Shadowbrook, it was a crack in the wall of Amelia's deception. He mentioned the strange case to a colleague a week later. Two physicians discussing symptoms over brandy, unable to diagnose a disease that wasn't a disease at all. It was a meticulously administered poisoning. The conversation would have been forgotten, just another medical puzzle. But Dr. Thorne couldn't shake that one nagging detail about the calomel. Why lie about something so small? What was Mistress Hawthorne really giving those men? The question hung in the air unanswered as the first of the three men began to die, a surreal or chilling visual description. Picture the black leather book Amelia reads from at the brook. It's not an ancient grimoire, it's a custom-bound journal. Inside, the pages are filled not with demonic script, but with the precise scientific handwriting of a man. It's a medical protocol detailing dosages of arsenic, mercury, and digitalis, interspersed with passages of fake Latin and psychological instructions on how to induce a state of learned helplessness. It's the anatomy of a murder written like a prescription. In early July, the facade of normalcy at Shadowbrook shattered completely. Jeremiah Ellis, while attempting to work on the cotton gin, collapsed. He didn't stumble. He simply fell forward, as if his strings had been cut, his body crashing onto the hard-packed earth. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow. When he was finally revived, he was lost. He didn't know his own name. He didn't recognize the faces of the men who had worked alongside him for years. His speech was a garbled mess. The overseer, a pragmatic and brutal man named Harlan Voss, reported it to Amelia. Her response was chilling. She barely glanced at Jeremiah. She declared he had been drinking, a lie Harlan knew to be false, and ordered him confined to his cabin with only bread and water. 2 days later, Elias Grant fell at the forge, his legs buckling beneath him as he hammered a glowing piece of iron. He was found muttering incoherently, his powerful body convulsing. Amelia's orders were the same. Isolation. The enslaved community was now in the grip of a cold, silent terror. This wasn't sickness. This was a calling. Their strongest, most vital men were being hollowed out and discarded. The whispers in the quarters at night were no longer just about root work. They were about murder. An old woman named Mira, a respected healer who remembered the old ways from Africa, knew she had to do something. She confronted Nathaniel, pressing a small bag of protective roots into his hand, begging him to tell her what the mistress was doing. Nathaniel looked at the charm as if it were a strange rock, let it fall from his limp fingers into the dust, and walked away. Mira, in an act of incredible bravery, went to the overseer, Harlan Voss. She told him the mistress was draining the life from the men at the brook every morning. Harlan, a man who believed only in the whip and the ledger, laughed at her superstitious nonsense. But after he dismissed her, he stood for a long time looking towards the path that led to Whispering Brook. He was not a good man, but he was a man who understood order. And what was happening at Shadowbrook was the slow, deliberate descent into chaos. Harlan Voss was not a man given to flights of fancy. He was paid to extract maximum work for minimum cost. Dead or incapacitated workers were bad for the bottom line. He began to watch Amelia, not with suspicion, but with a cold, calculating curiosity. He noted her pre-dawn departures. He noted the methodical, almost ritualistic way Jeremiah, Elias, and Nathaniel would follow her at a distance. He also noticed something else, something deeply unsettling. As the 3 men withered, Amelia seemed to bloom. The grief of her widowhood had been replaced by a strange predatory vitality. She looked younger. She moved with a purpose and energy that felt unnatural. It was as if their life force was quite literally being siphoned into her. The idea was absurd, the stuff of slave superstitions, but the evidence was right before his eyes. So he began his own quiet investigation. He started rising earlier, hiding himself in the woods where he could observe the path to the brook. He never got close enough to see the ritual itself. Some primal instinct warned him that to witness it would be to become part of it. But he saw them go, and he saw them return, the men stumbling like sleepwalkers, Amelia walking with a brisk, energized stride. He talked to the house servants, piecing together fragments of information. The strange, unmarked letters from New Orleans, the deliveries of chemical supplies from an apothecary in Mobile, the 2 years Amelia had spent at a ladies' academy in New York before her marriage, a place known for its progressive and some said radical scientific curriculum. He was assembling the pieces of a puzzle without knowing what the final picture would be. He knew it was ugly. He knew it was dangerous. And he suspected it might be valuable because in the antebellum South, the secrets of the wealthy were a form of currency, and Harlan Voss was beginning to realize he was sitting on a fortune. Now we must travel from the humid fields of Alabama to the bustling ports of New Orleans and pull back the curtain on the puppet master. His name was Dr. Reginald Voss. He was a physician, a brilliant one who had been run out of Boston years earlier for conducting grotesque and unauthorized experiments on the patients of a mental asylum. He had reinvented himself in New Orleans as a medical consultant to the desperate elite. He specialized in what he called vital transfusion therapy, a seductive and entirely fraudulent theory that blended European occultism, mesmerism, and cutting-edge toxicology. He promised the one thing the wealthy feared losing more than their money, their youth. He claimed he could transfer the life force, the essential vitality, from a young, healthy subject to an older, declining one. His clients were dying men, aging socialites, people who would pay any price for a miracle. Amelia had met him 2 years earlier during a visit to her family. She attended one of his private lectures and was captivated. Here was a man who spoke a language of science and power that resonated with the dark theories she had been cultivating in her own mind for years. She arranged a private consultation. In his office, surrounded by anatomical charts and jars of preserved oddities, she finally confessed the secret that was eating her alive. It wasn't just a suspicion. It was a certainty that had grown in the dark, silent nights of her marriage. She believed Elias Hawthorne was not the father of her children, and she believed he had used enslaved men, Jeremiah, Elias, and Nathaniel, to father them for him without her knowledge or consent. She was convinced he had drugged her, violated her by proxy, all to conceal the shame of his own sterility and preserve the illusion of his virile Hawthorne bloodline. A disturbing real-world quote: "The capacity of the human mind to believe that which it desires to be true in defiance of all evidence is the most powerful and dangerous force in this world." Dr. Alan H. Robert, paraphrasing a common sentiment in 19th century medical ethics. Can you honestly? What would you do if you believed with every fiber of your being that you had been the victim of a violation so profound it rewrote your own family history? Amelia laid out her evidence to Reginald. The way her children bore no resemblance to Elias. The way they shared physical traits, even the unique arc-shaped birthmark with the 3 enslaved men. The way Elias had avoided her bed for years, blaming her late-night reading habits while secretly orchestrating this grand deception. Whether it was true, or the elaborate delusion of a woman trapped in a loveless marriage on an isolated plantation, is a question we may never answer. But Amelia believed it. Her belief was absolute, and it had curdled into a cold, murderous rage. She told Reginald she didn't just want justice. She wanted reclamation. She wanted to take back the youth, the vitality, the years of her life that had been stolen and spent bearing children who were a monument to her own humiliation. She wanted to reverse the process. She wanted to drain the men who embodied her husband's betrayal and absorb their strength into herself. Reginald listened, his face a mask of sympathetic understanding. He was a master predator who recognized a wounded soul he could manipulate. He told her it was possible. He told her his treatments could do exactly what she desired. But it would be difficult. It would require her absolute, unquestioning obedience. He would provide the instructions, the chemical formulas, the ritualistic framework. She would be his remote research scientist. The cost was $4,000, an astronomical sum. Amelia agreed without a moment's hesitation. She had her own inheritance, and she was willing to spend every last cent to buy back her life, even if it was paid for with the lives of 3 other people. The letters from Reginald began arriving at Shadowbrook, plain envelopes with no return address containing the blueprint for murder. It was a masterpiece of psychological and chemical warfare. The instructions were terrifyingly specific. Amelia was to begin by introducing small calibrated doses of mercury and arsenic compounds into the men's food. These were not meant to kill. Not yet. They were meant to weaken them, to create suggestibility, to make their minds pliable and their bodies compliant. This was the preparation phase. The real treatment would begin only after Elias was dead. Reginald's protocol for the Brook ritual was a work of diabolical genius. The pre-dawn hour to create disorientation, the cold water to induce physiological shock, the forced nakedness to strip away identity and individuality, the chanting in a non-existent language to create an aura of mystical power and prevent any rational understanding of the events. It was all designed to break their will, to dismantle their sense of self, to make them believe in their own dissolution. The bloodletting was a key component, not for any medical reason, but for its immense psychological power. It made the transfer of life feel real, tangible. Amelia, in her desperate and rage-filled state, believed she was absorbing their vitality. In reality, she was simply poisoning them slowly and systematically while performing a series of theatrical gestures that Reginald had invented to give her a sense of control. He was playing her as masterfully as she was playing her victims. He was turning her grief and rage into a private long-distance clinical trial. You're not supposed to know this, but men like Reginald existed in the shadows of 19th century medicine. They preyed on the wealthy and the desperate, using the language of science to cloak their fraudulent and often lethal practices. They were the shadow elites of their day. But Reginald had a secret of his own. He was playing a double game. While he was mailing instructions for murder to Amelia, he was also documenting every detail she reported back to him. He was compiling her meticulous notes on the men's decline, their weight loss, their cognitive decay, their physical collapses into a case study. He planned to publish a groundbreaking monograph on his vital transfusion therapy using the Shadowbrook experiment as his proof. The 3 dying men were nothing more than data points to him. Amelia, his collaborator, was just another variable in his equation. And there was a third player in this deadly game. Reginald had another correspondent in Montgomery County, someone who was paying him an additional fee for copies of all his correspondence with Amelia, someone who was monitoring her descent into madness with a vested interest. This person wasn't interested in medicine or revenge. They were interested in property, in land, in the vast wealth of the Shadowbrook Plantation. They were waiting patiently for Amelia to go so far over the edge, to commit an act so monstrous and undeniable that she could be legally removed from control of her late husband's estate. Reginald was not just providing a service. He was building a legal case against his own client. He was helping Amelia destroy herself, all while another predator circled, waiting to pick the bones of the Hawthorne legacy. Amelia believed she was the one in control, the one dispensing a righteous if terrible justice. In truth, she was a pawn in 2 separate games, a puppet whose strings were being pulled from New Orleans and from right there in her own county. She was surrounded by enemies she couldn't even see. A timeline shift. Let's jump forward 70 years to 1912. An attorney in New Orleans is settling the estate of Amelia's niece, Eliza's daughter. He finds a locked trunk. Inside is a single preserved letter written by Amelia from the Alabama State Asylum in 1850. The attorney reads it once, then immediately burns it. He tells a colleague years later, "It was not the letter of a mad woman. It was the letter of a demon who understood her own damnation and regretted none of it." By August, the Alabama heat was a physical presence, a suffocating blanket that smothered the sounds and slowed the pace of life at Shadowbrook. The rituals at Whispering Brook, however, did not slow. They intensified. The oppressive heat seemed to fuel Amelia's mania. She increased the chemical dosages, extending the sessions in the brook until the men were shivering uncontrollably despite the sweltering air. She added new cruel elements to the ritual, forcing them to ingest bitter tinctures that made them vomit, rubbing caustic pastes onto their skin that left weeping sores. She was no longer following a protocol. She was improvising, her cruelty growing with her obsession. Jeremiah, Elias, and Nathaniel were dying. It was no longer a slow decline. It was a rapid, horrifying collapse. Their skin was stretched tight over their bones. Their eyes sunk deep into their skulls. They were living skeletons, animated by the last flickering remnants of a life that was being systematically extinguished. And then the overseer, Harlan Voss, made his move. He knew he had to act before all 3 men were dead, before his living evidence was gone. One afternoon, while Amelia was entertaining guests, he slipped into her bedroom. It was an incredible risk. If he were caught, he would be whipped, possibly killed. But the potential reward was too great to ignore. He went directly to her closet to a loose floorboard he had noticed weeks earlier. He pried it up, and there it was, the locked wooden box. Using a small iron bar, he forced the lock inside. His breath caught in his throat. It was all there. Reginald's letters laying out the entire conspiracy in cold scientific detail. Amelia's journals documenting every ritual, every dosage, every symptom in her own hand. And the most damning piece of all, a half-finished letter from Amelia to Reginald, a letter filled with a flicker of doubt where she wondered aloud if she was a visionary doctor or just a common murderer. Harlan didn't take everything. He was too smart for that. He selected the most incriminating letters, a section of the journal, and the unfinished letter expressing doubt. He put the rest back, replaced the box, and fixed the floorboard, leaving the room exactly as he had found it. Then he rode like the devil himself was chasing him to Fairmont to the office of an ambitious, morally flexible attorney named Landon Greer. Greer read the documents, his eyes widening with each page. He understood immediately what Harlan had brought him. It wasn't just evidence of cruelty, which the courts would likely ignore. It was proof of insanity. The letters and journals painted a portrait of a woman completely detached from reality. A woman in the grip of a violent, paranoid delusion. This was the key. Under Alabama law, a person deemed mentally incompetent could be stripped of their legal authority. A guardian would be appointed by the court to manage their affairs. And the Shadowbrook estate, with its thousands of acres and dozens of slaves, was one of the most valuable prizes in Montgomery County. Greer explained the strategy to Harlan. They couldn't move yet. They had to be patient. Let Amelia continue. Let her hang herself with her own rope. They needed more evidence, more witnesses. They needed the situation to become so undeniably horrific that the court would have no choice but to intervene. Harlan agreed, but his conscience, or perhaps just his practicality, pricked him. "What about the men?" he asked. "They're dying." Greer waved a dismissive hand. "Their deaths," he explained with a chilling pragmatism, "would only strengthen the case against her. Their suffering was a necessary part of the legal strategy. You're not just watching this, you're becoming part of it. You're beginning to see the layers of evil here. Not just Amelia's madness, but the cold, calculating greed of the men who watched it unfold, waiting for their moment to profit from it. But Amelia was not a fool. She was paranoid. Yes, she was delusional, but she was also hyper-vigilant. The moment she returned to her room, she knew something was wrong. A faint scratch on the floorboard that wasn't there before. The way the contents of the box felt subtly shifted. It was an animal instinct, the instinct of a creature who knows its lair has been invaded. And she knew with absolute certainty who had done it. Harlan Voss, the overseer. He had been watching her. He had been asking questions. She had underestimated him. She had believed her status as mistress of the plantation made her untouchable. She had forgotten that in the viper's nest of the Old South, loyalty was a commodity, and a white man's ambition would always trump his duty to a woman, even his employer. Her response was swift, silent, and brutal. She summoned Harlan to the study that evening. There was no shouting, no accusations, just a cold, final dismissal. His wages were on the desk. He was to be off Shadowbrook property by sunrise. If he ever spoke a word of what he thought he knew, if he ever tried to use what he had stolen, she would use her family's considerable power in New Orleans to utterly destroy him. She would see to it he was blacklisted from every plantation in the South. He would be ruined. Harlan took his money and left without a word. He knew he had lost this first battle, but he had the ammunition for the war. He rode straight back to Greer's office, the stolen letters burning a hole in his saddlebag. The two men worked through the night, drafting the first legal petitions. The net was beginning to tighten around Amelia, but she was not an animal to be easily trapped. She was one that would chew off its own leg to escape, and she was about to become even more dangerous. A chilling visual description. Think of Amelia's hands. Not the delicate, soft hands of a plantation lady, but hands that are becoming raw and chapped from the brook water and the chemicals she handles daily. There are faint brown stains under her fingernails from the tinctures. They are the hands of a killer who is so immersed in her work that she no longer cares about keeping up appearances. They are the evidence she carries with her everywhere. The dismissal of the overseer sent a shockwave through Shadowbrook. It was a sign of instability at the very top of the brutal plantation hierarchy. Amelia promoted a lesser man to the role, but he lacked Harlan's authority, and the enslaved community, sensing a shift in the power dynamic, began to push back in small, subtle ways. Work slowed, tools went missing. A quiet, simmering resistance began to build. Amelia, feeling her control slip, responded with escalating violence. The sound of the whip became more common. Rations were cut. She was a queen clinging to a crumbling throne, and her response was to tighten her grip, to crush any hint of dissent. And through it all, the dawn rituals continued. They were her anchor, her source of power, the one thing she still believed she could control. Then, on August 15th, Jeremiah Ellis died. He didn't die at the brook. He died in his cabin in the middle of the night. His body just stopped. After months of abuse and poison, his system finally gave out. Amelia's reaction was terrifying in its lack of humanity. She ordered him buried immediately in an unmarked grave with no ceremony. In the plantation ledger, she wrote a single dismissive entry: Jeremiah, fever. His life, his skills, his suffering, reduced to 2 words. His death did not give her pause. It did not make her question her methods. It did the opposite. It emboldened her. In her twisted logic, his death was a sign the treatment was working. His vitality had been fully transferred. She had absorbed him completely. That evening she doubled the dosages for Elias and Nathaniel. She had a new resolve. She would see this through to the end. The experiment was not over. Eliza could not bear it any longer. She had watched her mother orchestrate a slow-motion murder, had lived in a house thick with fear and unspoken horror, and now a man was dead. Her loyalty to her mother was finally severed by the profound moral injury of what she was witnessing. In an act of desperate courage, she wrote a letter not to the local authorities, who she knew would do nothing, but to her Aunt Beatrice Langford in New Orleans. Beatrice was her mother's sister-in-law, a formidable woman of high society, but one Eliza knew to be sensible and compassionate. With trembling hands, Eliza detailed everything: her mother's pre-dawn walks, the terrifying changes in the 3 men, the strange chemical smells, Jeremiah's death. She poured all of her fear and confusion onto the page. She gave the sealed letter to a trusted house servant, one of the few people she felt hadn't been touched by her mother's madness, with instructions to mail it secretly from Fairmont. That letter, a child's desperate plea for help, was a lit fuse traveling slowly toward the powder keg at Shadowbrook. It would take 12 days to reach New Orleans, 12 days in which Amelia, unaware of this new betrayal, would continue her deadly work. Unbeknownst to Eliza, her letter was about to converge with 2 other forces moving against her mother. In Fairmont, Harlan Voss and Landon Greer were finalizing their legal petition, armed with the stolen documents, and Dr. Thorne, his professional conscience finally overriding his reluctance to interfere, was preparing to file his own formal complaint with the county sheriff, detailing the suspicious symptoms of poisoning he had observed. All 3 lines of attack, familial, legal, and medical, were about to intersect at Shadowbrook. Amelia was a spider at the center of a web of her own making, but she was about to discover that other, larger webs had been woven all around her. On September 10th, Dr. Thorne arrived at Shadowbrook, his face grim. He told Amelia he was there for a follow-up on the family's health, a pretense she saw through immediately. He insisted on examining Elias Grant and Nathaniel Hayes. Amelia refused. They were her property, she reminded him, and their health was her concern alone. But the doctor stood his ground, his voice firm with a newfound authority. He was there, on the request of her family in New Orleans, he said, a bluff that was close enough to the coming truth. Reluctantly, Amelia led him to Elias's cabin. The sight that greeted the doctor was something from a nightmare. Elias lay on a dirty straw pallet, barely breathing. He was skeletal, his skin covered in sores, his gums and fingernails a sickening blue-gray, the classic, undeniable sign of heavy metal poisoning. Dr. Thorne's professional demeanor cracked. This was not fever. This was torture. He examined Nathaniel and found the same horrific symptoms. He turned to Amelia, his voice shaking with a mixture of fury and disbelief. "In God's name, woman, what have you been giving them?" And for the first time, Amelia's mask of sanity slipped. She began to explain, her voice high and strained, about Dr. Reginald's protocol, about the vital transfusion, about the therapeutic bathing and tinctures designed to restore her own health by drawing on their excess vitality. Dr. Thorne listened, his horror growing with every word. He recognized the chemicals she named, mercury, arsenic, digitalis, as deadly poisons. "You are not curing yourself," he told her, his voice low and damning. "You are murdering these men." Amelia drew herself up, a flash of her old imperious self returning. "You do not understand," she said, her voice dropping to a chilling whisper. "They deserved it. It was a correction, a balancing of the scales, and it is working. I have never felt more alive." If you believe this story needs to be told, share this video. Some histories are too important to remain buried. Hit that like button to help the algorithm unseal this truth. Dr. Thorne fled Shadowbrook as if escaping a plague house. He rode directly to the sheriff's office and filed a formal report. His testimony, a damning account of poisoning, torture, and a mistress lost to a homicidal mania. His report, combined with the legal petition filed by Landon Greer, using Harlan's stolen letters as evidence, created a perfect storm. The authorities could no longer look away. On October 1, 1842, Sheriff Harlan Reed and 2 deputies rode up the long Pine Line drive to Shadowbrook. They weren't there to arrest her. Not yet. The law concerning what a person could do to their own property was murky and horrific, but they carried a court order. Amelia Hawthorne was to be temporarily stripped of her authority over the plantation and her children. She was ordered to submit to a mental competency examination by a panel of physicians. A temporary guardian, her Aunt Beatrice Langford, was already on her way from New Orleans. It was over. Amelia stood on the grand veranda watching the lawmen approach, and she knew it. She didn't scream or fight. She received the news with the same eerie calm she had displayed at her husband's funeral. She had lost the game. But as the sheriff read the order, her eyes were not on him. They were looking past him towards the fields, towards the slave quarters, towards Whispering Brook. It was a look of profound, chilling disappointment. Not of remorse for what she had done, but of regret that her work had been interrupted. The experiment had not been completed. The purification was not yet finished. She had failed. And in that moment, the entire world that had conspired against her, her husband, the doctors, the lawyers, her own daughter, became one single malevolent entity in her mind. The competency hearing was a formality. 3 physicians, including a deeply shaken Dr. Thorne, questioned Amelia for 5 hours in a stuffy room at the Fairmont courthouse. She tried to appear rational. She spoke of her husband's betrayal in calm, logical terms. She defended Reginald's theories with scientific language she had memorized from his letters. She argued that the tangible improvement in her own health was undeniable proof that the treatments worked. But her delusion was a fortress, and every question they asked was a new brick in its wall. The moment they pressed her on the morality of her actions, on Jeremiah's death, on the suffering of Elias and Nathaniel, the facade crumbled. She showed no empathy, no remorse. She spoke of the men as if they were laboratory animals, necessary sacrifices for a greater scientific and personal truth. The physician's conclusion was swift and unanimous. Amelia Hawthorne was suffering from a severe delusional disorder, a paranoid mania that made her a danger to herself and others. She was declared legally insane. Her aunt, Beatrice Langford, arrived a week later and took control of the chaos at Shadowbrook. She was a pragmatic, no-nonsense woman, horrified by the stories she was hearing. She had Amelia confined to an upstairs bedroom, a prisoner in her own home. She immediately halted the rituals and brought in proper medical care for the 2 surviving men, though she was warned it was too late. Then, Beatrice began her own investigation. Determined to understand how this nightmare had been allowed to happen, she hired men to find Reginald Voss in New Orleans, but he was gone. Vanished. His office was empty, his trail cold. It was as if the puppet master had simply dissolved into thin air the moment his puppet strings were cut. But Reginald had left a trail. In his abandoned office, investigators found copies of his letters, not just to Amelia, but to the lawyer, Landon Greer. The second conspiracy was laid bare. Beatrice Langford, holding letters that proved Greer had been paying Reginald for information, that he had deliberately allowed the horror at Shadowbrook to escalate for his own financial gain, took the evidence to the court. The scandal was immense. Greer was disbarred and fled the state, a disgraced villain. Harlan Voss, who had been a pawn in Greer's game, testified to everything he saw, his initial greed overshadowed by the genuine horror of what he had uncovered. The official narrative began to form. Amelia was a madwoman, yes, but she was a madwoman who had been expertly manipulated by one charlatan and callously enabled by another. But for Beatrice, one question remained, the one that had started it all. What had her brother-in-law, Elias Hawthorne, actually done? Was Amelia's story of a grand sexual deception a complete fabrication of her broken mind? Or was there a grain of truth at the heart of her madness? Driven by a need to know, to truly understand the legacy her nieces and nephews had inherited, Beatrice hired a private detective, a former policeman from New Orleans, known for his discretion and his tenacity. He was tasked with digging up the buried secrets of Amelia Hawthorne. What he found was worse than anything Amelia had imagined. It was a truth so simple, so common to the institution of slavery, and yet so profoundly twisted that it recontextualized everything. It explained the motive not as pure madness, but as a monstrous reaction to a monstrous truth. The detective's investigation was a slow, quiet archaeology of secrets. He reviewed old plantation records. He spoke to the oldest slaves on the property, people who had been at Shadowbrook since before Amelia arrived. And he uncovered the truth. Amelia Hawthorne had not been sterile. Far from it. Before he ever married Amelia, he had fathered multiple children with enslaved women on his plantation. This was his dark secret. He kept these children, his own unacknowledged mixed-race offspring, at Shadowbrook. He didn't sell them away. He gave them privileged positions. He had them trained in valuable skills. Jeremiah the carpenter, Elias the blacksmith, Nathaniel his personal servant. These were not random men. They were his sons. They were the living, breathing evidence of his power and his hypocrisy. He had brought his new bride, Amelia, into a home already populated by his secret family. Amelia, intelligent and observant, had noticed the things a wife would notice. The physical resemblances between her own children, born years later, and these three favored slaves. The peculiar arc-shaped birthmark, a Hawthorne family trait appearing on both her children and his. She had pieced together a version of the truth. She was right that her husband had deceived her. She was right that her children shared a bloodline with Jeremiah, Elias, and Nathaniel. But her conclusion, born of isolation, paranoia, and a profound sense of violation, was twisted. The men hadn't been brought to her bed. They hadn't been used to impregnate her. The truth was far more intimate, and in the context of Southern honor, far more grotesque. Jeremiah, Elias, and Nathaniel were her children's half-brothers. Elias had created a family tree so poisoned, so tangled with secrets and lies, that when his wife finally discovered a part of it, the revelation drove her to murder. Let that sink in. The entire ritual, the entire descent into madness and murder, was a grotesque, misdirected act of revenge. Amelia, believing she was punishing the instruments of her violation, was actually murdering her husband's sons, her own stepsons, by the brutal logic of slavery. She was destroying the very bloodline she thought she was purifying. This revelation changes everything. It doesn't excuse her actions, but it frames them in the context of a betrayal so profound it's difficult to comprehend. She lived for years in a house with her husband's other family, forced to interact with them, to manage them, while a suspicion grew in her heart that she was part of some monstrous deception. Her madness was not born from nothing. It was a cancer that grew from a seed of truth planted by her husband's lies. The final act of the tragedy at Shadowbrook played out quickly. Elias Grant died on October 12, 1842. His body finally gave out. Nathaniel Hayes, the last of the three, survived, but the man he had been was gone forever. The poisons had destroyed his mind. He lived for 9 more years, a mindless, shuffling ghost cared for by the other slaves, a living monument to the horror that had consumed the plantation. He was a constant, silent reminder of the mistress's madness and the master's secrets that had caused it. He was 36 years old when he finally died. The official cause was listed with no sense of irony as natural causes. Amelia Hawthorne was never tried for murder. In 1842, Alabama, a slave owner could not be charged with murdering their own property. Beatrice Langford, desperate to shield her young nieces and nephews from any more scandal, pulled strings. The entire affair was quietly swept under the rug. In December, Amelia was discreetly committed to the Alabama State Asylum. She would spend the next 12 years there, dying of pneumonia in 1854. The records from her confinement describe a quiet, withdrawn patient who spent her days writing endlessly in journals. Journals the asylum staff regularly confiscated and burned. They said she never spoke of Shadowbrook. She never spoke of the men she had killed. She simply wrote, filling page after page with a story no one else was ever allowed to read. Her children were raised in New Orleans by their Aunt Beatrice. They were told a heavily censored version of the story that their mother had fallen ill with a terrible grief after their father's death. Shadowbrook itself, the site of the horror, was sold off. By the time of the Civil War, the house was gone, burned by Sherman's army, and the land was broken up. The name Shadowbrook faded from memory. The story became a local legend, a ghost story. People said the curve in Whispering Brook was haunted. They said the water ran cold there, even in the summer, and that if you listened closely on a quiet night, you could hear chanting in a language no one understood. The truth, in all its horrifying complexity, was buried. But buried things have a way of working their way back to the surface. The story ends with a chilling symbolic moment. In 1850, from the asylum, Amelia wrote one last letter to her daughter Eliza. It was found decades later, a single page that escaped the fires. In it, she doesn't ask for forgiveness. She doesn't express remorse. She simply writes, "I have learned there is a freedom in being mad. They cannot touch you. You are no longer bound by their rules, their truths. I gave them a story of violation and revenge they could understand. A story that fit their small world. The real story is that I found a door out of that world and I walked through it. I only regret that I could not take you with me." This story is a brutal reminder that the most monstrous acts are often born from the most intimate betrayals. The system of slavery created a world of hidden power structures and suppressed truths where human lives were currency and secrets were weapons. Amelia was both a victim and a villain. Her rage and trauma, twisted by a patriarchal system, could only be expressed as violence against those even more powerless than herself. What do you believe was the greater evil? Amelia's murderous ritual or the lifetime of deceit by her husband that pushed her to it? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think was the real monster in this story? The widow's twisted revenge or the secrets that ignited it? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if this chilling tale from America's hidden past gripped you, smash that like button, subscribe for more untold histories, and hit the bell to never miss an episode. Thanks for joining me. Stay curious, and I'll see you in the next one.